So today we're going to look at an extremely low mileage MGB LE that I believe has a pretty interesting backstory. So this is not a car that was purchased new as an investment by somebody and then put on mothballs expecting that they would make a bunch of money on it sometime in the future, like a lot of the really low mileage cars coming out of the woodwork today. But we'll get to that after we look around it. And look at this front bumper. That is about as factory fresh of a bumper as I can remember seeing. Almost no UV damage whatsoever on it. This car is not 100% original. It does have some rock guards that have been installed on to the headlights along with a few other things. But coming back here, even the sun visors here aren't exploding apart, sagging or anything. And the dashboard here is as perfect as when it left, as the day it left the factory. Now, when I say this is a low mileage car, I mean it's a low mileage car. It's got 1,560 miles on it. See, come in here, look. You didn't hear me wrong. 1,560 miles, and that is fully documented original miles. And yes, the clock does work. The owner asked me to unplug it because he doesn't always keep it 24/7 on a battery tender, and he didn't want the battery to go dead. And so he said, could you disconnect the clock for me while you're in here? Now it does have a Nardi wood steering wheel on it, which is a pretty nice wheel, and a wooden shift knob. Now this does not have overdrive in it, so it doesn't need the switch. It has had some, floor mats put in, some stuff that's been bought recently since he's owned it to protect the carpet, keep it from getting trashed, from using it. And it's had a cover back here with an MG emblem in it as well. But if you look at the interior, there is just no wear. This is pretty much just like it left the factory. And yes, these cars weren't perfect when they left the factory. Sometimes you saw little wrinkles like this right off the showroom floor. And now that one could potentially be from something sitting against it in storage or something, I don't know. But yeah, you could see stuff like this right from the factory. And we got the boot. Looks to be still really in nice shape here. And even the rear bumper here is just as nice as the front bumper, and even better, with not even having any staining from fuel drips like you usually see on these rubber bumper cars. So this really is a really nice, tidy example. And of course, with that kind of mileage, it should be tidy. But this thing does drive every bit as nice as you think it would. It literally feels like a brand new car. So tight, so smooth and quiet that it's a dream to drive. So what is the story on this car? Well, this car was never sold new back in the day. An import dealer local to the general area here who sold MGs had imported this car in as the very last car that they ever imported from MG. And they kept it for themselves for 30 years. And it stayed on the showroom floor for roughly 20 of those years as a attention getter and something to show off that we got an LE in the showroom floor. And it sat next to Porsches and everything else all through the 80s and 90s. And then was put into their private collection for about 10 years before the current owner purchased it from them, where it had 7 miles on it and had never even been titled yet. So the first title that was ever issued was for the current owner. And the only time they ever used this car was moving the showroom around, changing it up, remodeling, things like that. So that's why it didn't get any use. Now, in addition to these cars never being exactly perfect from the factory, there are some flaws in the paint here, because this was sitting in the middle of a showroom for 20 years with the general public walking around it. So I wouldn't be surprised if some portions of this has even been repainted at some point. I believe the bonnet may have been, but I haven't looked close enough to tell you for sure if anything actually has been. But with the general public walking around it, all kinds of things could happen to them, and they could end up looking a lot worse than what this thing looks like today. This thing actually presents really nicely, but there is a minor little dent in this side here, probably from someone leaning against it in the showroom. So let's look underneath the bonnet now, where it is super clean, but a little less original. After the current owner purchased this car, he did actually end up taking it to a mechanic, and they went bumper to bumper, went clear through the car, made sure all hoses, hydraulics, brakes, fuel system, and everything was up to snuff to actually be able to use the car, because after 30 years of no mileage, you're not just going to jump in it and drive it. So it is super clean underneath here. It has been rust proof, that's why you see this here, but it still even retains the grease pencil markings here from the last digits of the VIN number, where they take these bonnets off at the factory, put them aside, and then once they finish doing all the mechanical work, then they put it on at the end of the line. That way they make sure the bonnets stay with the car that it came off of. Now, after he drove it for the very first time, he realized these really late cars were pretty sluggish, which they were, and he had never owned one this late. He'd always owned earlier MGs. So the Stromberg came off. He ended up putting a Weber on it, a header, and a sports exhaust. Now, if you've been on my channel very much, you'll know how I feel about the Webers, but they are a very popular carburetor to put on these things. They are reliable for the most part, and it does give it a lot more power than what it came from the factory with, but I would still prefer to see a pair of SUs because it would be a bit snappier and even better. But they took the air pump off and all the emissions stuff to go with it. And then after he started using the car, at some point, the advanced mechanism in the distributor, something broke. And he tried to get all original parts to fix it with, ended up just buying a used distributor, putting that in there with a Pertronix. Now, every single part that's been taken off this car has been put away and preserved, so that at any point in time, if he ever sells the car on to someone else, this thing can be put 100% back to the way it left the factory. So while I don't necessarily 100% agree with this carburetor, one thing I definitely do agree with is there used to be a valve right here in this bracket that was there for the mechanics to be able to push and shut the fuel off, but those were very unreliable and tended to leak fuel, and they could leak down on the exhaust and cause fires. I always disconnect these on any car that comes into my shop that still has it in place, but it had already been removed on this one. So since I had a car in here that was such low mileage and hadn't even been titled until the current owner purchased it, I thought that I had to at least do some sort of a video on it for you guys. Now, I would like to put it up on my lift, but unfortunately my lift is tied up right now, and I do not think there's any way I'm going to be able to get that freed up in time to be able to put this on the lift before the owner comes and gets it. So we're not going to get to look at the underside of it, unfortunately.